One thing that he did say is that a lot of these folks are probably having some sort of a panic attack. The war on drugs has been going on a century, and it is, just like he says, fueled by fear. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. The topic I am going to discuss today is John Oliver, one of his episodes on Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, and the episode was quite recent, I think about a week ago, on harm reduction. I've been asked to discuss what I think of it, is it accurate, and what are my general thoughts on it. I do have some expertise in this area. Keep in mind, I ran one of actually the first physician-driven harm reduction program in Orange County, and in fact, every single one of my enterprises, if you will, are sort of meshed with concepts of harm reduction, and I think that is how we achieve the success that we do achieve. Let us get started and move right into the topic. What do I think about John Oliver's episode on harm reduction on Last Week Tonight with John Oliver? I got a couple of notes here that I might peek over at that I wanted to make sure I discuss. He actually starts the discussion showing a public service announcement, and I don't know if it was made up because at the end of it there's quite a bit of drugs. And he shows this funny piece about telling people not to do drugs. And I think there's a major point he's trying to make here. Look, we all remember the Nancy Reagan shows, An Egg on a Frying Pan, This Is Your Brain, on drugs. Really, I think he's trying to drive home the point about how silly these public service announcements are and how little they do to affect our decision-making process. I would even argue that watching some of these probably makes people want to go do drugs. So he starts off with one of those and sort of does his usual skit and makes some jokes about it. And from there, he moves into some statistics, right? He talks about the 100,000 overdose deaths last year. He introduces the concept of fentanyl, which is a well-known synthetic opiate used by physicians in different areas, whether it's in the surgical theater, in the emergency department, for rapid day in and out procedures, and it's a great drug. But he brings that into the equation and discusses that 66,000 deaths of that 100,000 overdose deaths, fentanyl had something to do with it. He's correct in both of those descriptions. He also goes on to describe why the fentanyl is dangerous. And what he talks about is the fact he shows a couple of different physicians, an emergency medicine physician, in addition to a great doctor that I know of up in Fresno, California, that runs the needle exchange program up there. And they point out that sometimes people will come in and they've been taking pressed oxys and they had no idea, and the whole thing was fentanyl. Okay, he does a great job at describing this issue, and I'm going to add a little something to it. Look, it's true, fentanyl is very potent compared to morphine by weight. And what that means when you're doing illicit manufacturing on two sides, it might be harder to get the ratios right in your production line. On the side of the user, you have less margin of error. And so what you do is you create a really dangerous situation in potential overdoses. And that is how fentanyl is extremely deadly. From this, he actually moves on to some of the silly issues that have sort of evolved around this and shows law enforcement video talking about how deadly fentanyl is even if you touch it. And he actually moves on to describe all of the silly and insane and untrue promotion of an idea, touching fentanyl can kill you, and the potential consequences of that, okay? And he talks about how silly it is, whether it's law enforcement officials or state representatives, policymakers, all kinds of officials promoting magical thinking idea. And he points out correctly, this creates panic and fear in the public. Now what you get is from the first responder side, people having a lot of fear and not approaching the person that actually needs the help from the overdose. And then on the user side, the person can overdose. He's absolutely correct in this, and he delivers this in a really, really potent way, lacing it with humor. I really appreciate that. One thing that he did say is that a lot of these folks are probably having some sort of a panic attack. I want to refine that, and that was not bad for a layperson description, and it's out there. I just recently did a video on fentanyl overdose by touch, and what is happening is people are having what's called syncopal episodes. Check out my video on that. It informs you more on this topic. From there, he goes on to describe the fact that this kind of thing is very, very dangerous, and fueling the public's perception of things by fear and misinformation has really been the bedrock and the framework on the war on drugs that he describes that has been going on for decades. He's probably referring to the early 70s. I'm going to go back to 1914 and the Harrison Drug Act that got passed in Congress and what happened from that point on. So I'll take it back a century. The war on drugs has been going on a century, and it is, just like he says, fueled by fear, misinformation, and magical thinking. Where has it led to? He correctly points out to inappropriate criminalization, mandatory minimum sentences, and what this does, all of this, is it destroys families, it destroys individuals, and really lines the pocket of a few people. He skirts around this, but does a wonderful job at presenting it. In fact, I really like one quote that he says, something to the effect of, it is deeply troubling for leadership in police to be promoting medical misinformation and for the media to be perpetuating and really fostering the growth of that misinformation for the public. Well, that's what our public policy is based on. At this point, he jumps strictly into the concept of harm reduction. He gives a definition, and this definition, and he gives a really basic definition, which is very common, not one that I personally use because I use a slightly different one, but it doesn't matter. He basically says, look, harm reduction is accepting the reality, for whatever reason, that people are going to use illicit drugs, okay? Whether they can't or they don't want to, they're going to quit, they're going to use it. And he talks about needle exchanges. He talks about naloxone. And okay, from here he moves into strictly into harm reduction. He gives a basic definition that is very nice and clean. He says, look, the reality of it is people are going to use illicit drugs. The why doesn't matter. Whether they can't stop or they don't want to, they are going to use illicit drugs. So rather than arrest them and lock them up, why not mitigate the risks of using illegal drugs? After all, we keep talking about 100,000 overdoses. He gives a couple of examples of harm reduction. He talks about needle exchange clinics. He talks about testing reagents to check your drug and see what's in it. And from here, he really drives this point home. He's like, look, that's considered drug paraphernalia. And even though there are state carve-outs that bypasses federal laws to where you cannot have these things, it still, for the most part, can be ignored. It's difficult to test your drug to make sure there's no fentanyl in it, and you could end up getting locked up beautifully and clearly. I couldn't have said it better myself, and I certainly haven't heard any policymakers say it. People are being locked up for checking to see if there's fentanyl in their drug, or they can be locked up or used for probable cause for further search, etc. The point is we're sitting here talking about how do we reduce deaths. Well, the cheapest and easiest way is let them test their drugs. I actually say let's supply those, which we did at our needle exchange clinic. At this point, he also gives a little piece on Narcan, naloxone, the opiate reversal drug, and he also describes a barrier to that drug. He appropriately and rightly talks about what an amazing drug this is, how easy it is to use nowadays, and yet there's still barriers with that because it is under prescription only by the FDA. Yes, most states have a workaround. Yes, it's relatively easy to get, but nevertheless, there is still a barrier. From this point on, and so far, everything he said is right on the money. He moves on to really what I think is the gold nugget in harm reduction, overdose prevention centers or supervised injection sites. I have been an advocate for many, many, many years. Why? You can make overdoses go to zero. You can make, along with introducing needle exchanges at those places, you can make overdoses go to zero. You can provide the services needed for these folks to eventually get over the hump of their addiction and get back into society. You can decrease soft tissue infections, hepatitis C, HIV, endocarditis, and places that have already instituted such things, overdose deaths have gone to zero. So do we care about overdose deaths and substance abuse? Or do we care about people using that particular substance that is somehow in the magical world bad, and you're a bad person? We're stigmatizing a disease process that we can, for pennies on the dollar compared to the criminalization that we are utilizing, pennies on the dollar, keep these folks safe, keep them in their home, potentially keep them working, get them the mental health services they need. And by having a safe injection site, this might be the first place somebody that has been touched by trauma in their childhood, the first place in their life where they find human connection and safety. And he moves to the end of the video, really closing all us out quite succinctly. He tells us what the problem is, and he tells us what we need to do. He basically says, we need to stop stigmatizing those that use drugs. The issues run deep. We need to remove the barriers to naloxone. We need to remove the barriers to having drug paraphernalia and having a punitive response to that. We need to create safe injection sites, the first place that these people may have for the first time in their life any connection to other human beings. And we need to keep them safe, create opportunities for them to get into treatment, because the data shows clearly that's the way to go. And as a society, we need to move towards rational, formal, compassionate thinking. He does a couple more little pieces on Joe Biden. Here's my overall impression. Okay, John Oliver nails this. He uses humor. He has a sense of humor. He's witty. He's intellectual. He takes a very complex topic that even sometimes I find hard to wrap my head around and present it to folks. He distills the most important information about it. He gives us factual, evidence-based data. His criticism is right on target, meaning, hey, do you want to stop opiate overdose deaths? Here's how you do it. He talks about how we need to change our perception and views on those that use drugs, and we need to move forward with all of our policies. In short, I think the piece is done brilliantly, and I agree with everything that he says. and I might even use it for education for some of the places that how often I'm asked to talk about such issues. That's my thoughts on John Oliver and harm reduction. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked it, please press the like and subscribe button and consider donating to us on Patreon. See you next time. Peace.